Hi, Paul. Welcome, and
Hi.
welcome to everyone who's joining us. We'll just give them a few seconds for them to join us on the team on the group. It's a webinar style, so we're getting some people. Okay, I think attendees are joining us slowly. We'll just give them about 1 or 2 minutes. Chris has indicated a challenge, so we can start with you, Paul.
Okay. So should I start?
Give me a few seconds, Paul, just so that people come on board completely. I think there are a couple of people popping on. So in the meanwhile, let me give you, I think you can share your...
I haven't got it on here.
You should be able to...
What I sent off, I'd have to do it without it, unless you can show that. Sorry, I didn't.
All right. Did you send it to me, Paul?
Yes, I did.
All right, let me just
a couple of days ago.
Yeah.
If it's not, I can do it without, but it'd be nicer to show it.
Yeah, let me just quickly see if I've saved it. Yes, I do have it. Okay. All right. Let's perhaps just quickly introduce everyone. Thank you all for joining us. This is a webinar of the Joburg District Research Committee. It's intended to support research in Johannesburg, and we're very honored to have Professor Paul Ruff, who's from the SAHPRA. He works in that. He's got other things he'll tell you a little bit more about. But he's going to tell us a little bit about what the SAHPRA process is all about. We've also got Professor Stein, who's from UJ, and he'll talk about the UJ research, including the research committee and issues around that. So with that, thank you all very much. I'll hand over to you, Paul, and I think you can see, no, you can't see my screen. Let me just share your presentation.
Thank you.
That's Paul's presentation.
Oh, there we go.
Tell me next, and I'll proceed. I'll help you along.
Yeah. Thanks very much. Can you change the slides when I just ask you? So thanks, Shabir, for inviting me. So I'm going to talk a bit about clinical studies in South Africa. That slide did have my various affiliations. Just for those who don't know me, I'm the chair of the clinical trial committee at the SAHPRA, or South African Health Products Regulatory Authority. Also chair the National Tertiary Quaternary Essential Medicine List Committee and the Ministerial Advisory Committee on Cancer Control and Prevention. I'm head of medical oncology at the University of Witwatersrand, Faculty of Health Sciences. Next slide, please. So we're going to look at the role of SAHPRA and where it fits in and where it doesn't fit in, and basically how about regulatory submissions. Next, please. Now, SAHPRA, or South African Health Products Regulatory Authority, was established as an entity, as a sort of parastatal entity. I think it's a Category 3B entity on the 1st of February 2018, and it succeeded the old Medicine Control Council, which was part of the Department of Medicine, and used to fall under the auspices of Dr. Anban Pillay as the DDG, and they had a registrar who in the past was Ms. Mandisa Heller and Dr. Joey Gous. And when Joey went to WHO in Switzerland, Portia Nkambule became acting registrar, and then when SAHPRA was formed, she was acting CEO. And now SAHPRA does fall under the Minister of Health, but it's basically run by a board, and the chair of the board is Professor Helen Rees, and the board was appointed by the previous Minister of Health, Dr. Aaron Motsoaledi, and the board forms mainly a sort of governance and management and fiduciary function, It does not fulfill a scientific function, which was very different to the old MCC Council, which used to deal with the science and medicine as well as the governance. And so they've separated that out. So the board is not involved in any of the medical decisions. The SAHPRA itself is run by the CEO, Dr. Boitumelo Someti, who was appointed the beginning of January of last year. And Kumi, unfortunately, went straight headlong into COVID. So she's took a lot on her plate, and she, I think, has performed extremely well, considering all the pressures that we've had to deal with COVID. And I think I'm going to talk a little bit about COVID studies because it's been a big issue. Now, the actual board has subcommittees such as risk and audit and other committee boards, but most of the actual work of SAHPRA is done by the in-house people, including the financial management, inspectorate and regulation, medicine evaluation and registration and devices, diagnostics and radiation control. And Portia Nkambule now has become the CRO, as Chief Regulatory Officer, who deals with a lot of these. And then we have a number of expert committees that deal with the specific sort of functions. And the one that's obviously most important here is the Clinical Trial Committee that deals with clinical trials. Next slide, please. And this is just a sort of history of what happened, that all clinical trials still remain under the Medicine-Related Substance Control Act 101 of 1965, and unregistered medicines fall under Section 21. So all clinical trials, as well as the use of unregistered medicines, falls under Section 21 of the Act. And the conduct of trials, as I mentioned, goes through Regulation 34 of SAHPRA, previously MCC. And also we follow specific guidelines, South African GCP guidelines, which is a problem because the SA GCP guidelines that are presently available are 2006. We worked extensively on new guidelines, which were actually ready to go in 2019. But because of COVID, they've sort of been sitting on the side waiting for them to be signed off by the minister and the DG and that, and haven't come out yet, which is a great pity because 2006 is a long time ago, and the new SAGCB guidelines are, deal with a lot of things that we didn't know back in 2006. I'm hoping that the new guidelines will be signed off. They've all been done. It was a big project done by a combination of SAHPRA, including myself and Professor Leslie Burgess from University of Stellenbosch, plus the National Health Research Ethics Committee with Dr. Ann Pope and Dr. Manamela Sikwacha, and we worked together as a sort of team to develop the new SAGCP. And as I said, hopefully that'll be out soon because we really do need an update. And it looks bad when we're quoting 2006. RCH GCP is also followed as well, but SAGCP will always trump RCH GCP. And then I mentioned the role of NHREC, which is important in this, was important in this project, and it was also important to oversee the individual ethics committees, and all the ethics committees have to be registered through NHREC. Next slide, please. Now, when you do a clinical study, and just to say what has to go to SAHPRA, remember that SAHPRA is the South African Health Products Regulatory Authority. It deals with health products, not just medicines like the Medicine Control Council. And so all health products fall under SAHPRA's ambit. So it includes medicines, but it also includes two areas that we previously didn't deal with, and it's become quite an important part of the activity. And the one is medical devices, and that includes anything from a heart valve replacement to a hip replacement to a device that delivers medicines. All of that has to be approved by SAHPRA. And when those come to SAHPRA, they go to the Clinical Trial Committee, but they also go to the Medicines Devices Committee, because we evaluate the actual clinical trial aspect, but they need to evaluate the actual devices. And it can be difficult dealing with devices because the expertise needed for dealing with device studies is not quite as good as, because it's very new to us, unlike medicines where there's a lot of experience. And the third area that's important are IVDs, or in vitro devices, in other words, kits. And as you know, during COVID, all the kits for testing, PCR, antigen, antibody tests, etc., all of them have to be approved through SAHPRA now, and either for approval or if studies are done which use a device. And so the sort of role of SAHPRA has expanded quite significantly from the days of the NCC. Now, one thing with clinical trials, it's important that any study using a new medicine device, IVD, must go through SAHPRA. The only time that we do not require a formal protocol submission is in the case of what we call a notification with a phase 4 study. And that is when you have a study with a registered medicine, with a registered indication, a registered dose, a registered mode of administration, and a registered formulation. If you are doing a study like that, where then you can, all you need to do is there's a one-page document for a notification. It's a sort of tick box document which you say what it is. And if it fulfills all those requirements, then it requires to be notified on a one-page document to SAHPRA and does not require a full study. If there is, however, you were using a registered medication for an unregistered indication, such as what happened with COVID, where people wanted to study and still want to study some of the most crazy things in the treatment of COVID, that's not registered for COVID, even though it's a registered medicine, like what happened with chloroquine and ivermectin, which are bad examples. But basically anything using a registered medicine in an unregistered indication, or if you want to use a higher dose, or if you want to go from a IV to a subcut formulation, anything like that is a new study. But if everything is still the same, then you don't have to do a submission and you can apply for a notification. But basically anything else needs a clinical study, and you need to submit a protocol, which is a written detailed action plan, provides background about the study, specifies, and this is important in the submission, the actual objectives and endpoints. And these need to be clearly defined: primary endpoints, secondary endpoints, safety endpoints, exploratory endpoints in detail. And these need to be given in point form and to be justified. One of the problems we get with some submissions, especially those coming investigator-initiated trials or studies, these are muddled up. And it's important that the objectives are clear and hopefully not too many. We do get problems with some studies that have 20 objectives, which is, I think, as I was taught many years ago when I was in training, that when you do a clinical study, if you ask one question, you get one answer. If you ask 10 questions, you get no answers. And I think it's important that these things are focused, but sometimes we get many endpoints. But these are usually secondary or exploratory endpoints. The primary endpoints and objectives need to be very clear and concise. You obviously need to describe the design of the study, exactly how it's done and what type of study it is. Is this a phase 1 study? If it's a phase 1 study, is it a first in human study? Not many of these are done in this country, except at the FarmOff's people in Bloemfontein, who do phase 1 studies and first in human studies, which require a lot of specific monitoring and expertise, usually done in healthy volunteers, although in cancer it's usually done in patients who've got advanced disease and you have nothing else to offer. And these are really dose finding and looking for safety signals. Efficacy is not really the point of the study. Phase 2 studies are looking at safety. They do look at efficacy, but they are usually single-arm studies. You may get randomized phase 2 studies, but there isn't a standard of care. And phase 2 studies are usually not very well powered when it comes to numbers to draw any long-term conclusions. And then the most common studies that people do are phase 3 studies, which are randomized control studies. There may be 2 arms, there may be many arms, although the more arms, the more difficult. And it's important with these sort of studies that they are statistically valid. And one of the things that the SAHPRA Clinical Trial Committee, we have a statistician as one of our members who reviews the statistics of the study separately to the reviewer who looks at the science to make sure that it's statistically valid and that the stats are done properly, because otherwise it becomes a pointless exercise if this is not done properly. And in fact, we're about to appoint a second statistician because our present statistician is overwhelmed by all the work that we have to do. And this has been, especially with COVID, you may be aware that we've now reviewed almost 90 COVID studies in the last year and a bit. And that has put a massive load over and above all the normal studies that we do. We normally review 20 to 30 new clinical trials every 2-month cycle. And it's usually more in the beginning and end of the year. Obviously, in the studies, you need to give inclusion, exclusion criteria, which needs to be properly described. Your monitoring plan is very important, especially now with this whole thing about remote monitoring. We have to be careful about that, especially with COVID. It requires a lot of explanation. And then obviously it's got to follow the ICH GCP 27. And hopefully when I wrote this down, I was hoping that SAGCP 2021 would be out, but at the moment it's still 2006. Next, please. Okay, and so as I mentioned, they're predominantly medicines, also devices and IVDs. Commercial studies predominate from pharmaceutical companies and CROs, as well as device and test kit manufacturers. But we also see a lot of studies from academic investigators, and this has been particularly the case during COVID, where we've had a lot of investigator-initiated studies coming through, some really good, some really terrible, as always happens, but there's been a lot of people are doing clinical trials, which I think is important, and they're being done at all levels. I mean, in COVID, we've seen studies from prevention to early treatment in asymptomatic patients, to mildly symptomatic, to hospitalized, to ICU, etc. And as everyone knows, COVID doesn't just fall into one area, it's many different diseases. And we've had many studies looking at different areas and some very interesting work from pharma and also from local academic investigators as well. Of course, unfortunately, in this has also been some really bad quality submissions with very poorly thought out studies and very poor science that has made our job quite difficult. But, it's been a tough time, and we've been meeting long hours, even on nights and weekends. We've had meetings till 10:30 at night and on Saturday afternoons and even Sundays to deal with the massive load. We also get studies from groups like in cancer, things like ECOG and ERTC, local research groups like MRC, and then international bodies like WHO. You all know about the Solidarity study in COVID, which came through the WHO, which unfortunately turned out to be quite a flawed study, but it was an example of a sort of international study from the WHO. And as I said, we do all things phase 1, including first in human, phase 2, phase 3, and then the phase 4 I mentioned before, the sort of post-marketing studies. Next, please. Okay, now what happens? These are submitted to SAHPRA. There's a special form called the CTF1 form that has to be filled in by the applicant with the protocol and other documents, including CVs. Insurance is very important because of the risk of accidents, which we'll come back to. The investigator workload is an important document to see that the investigators actually can manage the work that they say they're going to do. And here we get some investigators give us garbage. I mean, we've seen people submit documents like this claiming that they work 168 hours a week and don't sleep. And this is obviously nonsense, and we send these back because, people need to actually tell us the truth and not to pretend that they're doing more than they really are. The HREC submission is important. And the PR declarations, and this is something we've insisted on of late, and it's very important, is that, I mean, every study done in this country, unless it's a single institution, even then has a national PR. Like with the COVID studies, we've had people like Glenda Gray and Shabir Mahdi being national PIs. And the national PI plays a very important role, especially in a multi-center study. National PI is to make sure that all the documents are properly done, that there are no mistakes, and the national PI is to sign off the documents to make sure that, and the national PI needs to take responsibility for what happens. And this has been important because in the past, national PIs often used to be almost a rubber stamp where the applicant or sponsor used to ask someone the day before to be national PI and they had nothing to do with it. And now we hold them responsible, and it's become a very important role with clinical studies is the national PI. And that's especially with COVID has come out, and you know, as everyone knows, say with the Sasonki study, which at times was not done as a study, although it's always been a study, there have been a lot of issues that have come up, and the two national PIs, Professor Glenda Gray and Professor Linda Gale Becker from UCT, have taken a lot of responsibility and had to do a lot of work in making sure that GCP is maintained and that these studies are done properly. So it's a very important role, and it's something that we take very seriously. We see 20 to 40 trials every cycle. The CTC has 11 members with expertise in all the areas. So we have a cardiologist, we have 2 oncologists, we have a couple of infectious, we have a virologist, and we have a microbiologist. We have someone with expertise in diabetes and hypertension, in rheumatology, in doing bioequivalence studies. We had a psychiatrist. Unfortunately, the psychiatrist who was on our committee, Dr. Jan Chabalala, passed away last year, and we don't have a psychiatrist at the moment, but we need to get a psychiatrist because psychiatric studies are very important, and you need psychiatric expertise in reviewing these type of studies. And we're always looking for experts to help as either reviewers who just review studies, but don't actually are not part of the committee, and ultimately committee members who are involved in the actual discussions about the studies. And we've had some new members join us recently, or who are still finding their feet in the committee and learning how to do these reviews and how to participate in the committee's work. Now, once the reviewer has done the review, and I'll give you an example in a couple of minutes what the document looks like. We have a template, because in the old days people used to write too many pages. Now we keep it on a template, and that is then presented to the clinical trial committee for discussion. We have a 2-day meeting every 2 months. We had one at the beginning of this month. The next one will be the end of the beginning of May. Now, next will be the end of June, and at which we discuss every study. The reviewer has to present it. There's vigorous discussion by all the members of the committee. Obviously, this is now done virtually. It used to be done face-to-face, but it's now done virtually. And after it's all done, the CTC decides what we should do with it, and the reviewer proposes, and then someone seconds it, so it's a fully legal process, and then the CTC votes and decides on what score this study should get, which I'll show you in a minute. And so that every decision that's made by the clinical trial committee is not made by one individual. It's made by a committee discussion with a proposer and a seconder and a vote. And if someone objects, the objection is noted If someone misses out on some of the discussion, they will abstain, which does happen. Someone may have gone to the bathroom or something, they have to abstain, so that we have a very vigorous review, and then a report with all the questions is sent to the applicant with the score, which we'll come to, and stating all the concerns that the committee has. Next slide, please. And these are the categories that you get from a SAHPRA study. And I'll just go through it briefly, and because what you see is tells you what you have to do. If you get a 1A, it means it's fully approved. A 1B means it's approved, but that the Human Research Ethics Committee approval is still pending, which is pretty straightforward. A 2A is not approved, but there are mainly logistic issues that can be sorted out by the in-house evaluators. It doesn't require external specialized review and can be done pretty quickly. That means if there's an insurance document missing, or if there's a CV that's wrong or something like that, this would make it a 2A. A 2B is the most common, which means that it's not approved, but it goes back to the original evaluator. It usually doesn't go to the committee, and the original evaluator and the in-house staff can look at it, and usually 9 times out of 10, the applicant will have answered the questions, and then the trial would be approved, or the study would be approved. A category 3 is something which unfortunately we are a category that we're giving more often than we used to, and that's when there are problems, and the problems are such that we need to have a full discussion from the committee again, where the issues raised are too complicated for the individual to deal with, and that's why it must go back to the full committee. And this, unfortunately, is becoming more common because we would like to avoid category 3s. It's a lot more work, but if there's a problem, this is what happens. Category 4 is unusual. It only occurs if there's a study where expertise doesn't exist in the committee. Occasionally you get a study where there's nobody in the committee who actually understands the subject. We have enough people, and it's rare, but every now and then we need to get an outside opinion from an expert in a field, and that would give it to category 4. Not common, but it may happen occasionally. Category 5 is the worst. It basically means that we've thrown it out, that we feel it's got no scientific validity, and it is rejected, and that if someone wants to come back and apply, they need to provide a full new submission. There's no sort of amendment or change as possible. We need a completely new submission. And then category 6, which we developed more recently, and that is, and we've unfortunately seen this often, this usually is at the secretariat level, where study is rejected because the documents are outstanding. There are no CVs, or the CVs aren't done properly. Insurance documents are inadequate. The workload documents are not submitted. And, you know, we can't expect the reviewers to deal with that sort of thing. So basically that implies that there's a sloppy submission, and that we will not look at it, and it needs to be redone. Every now and then one of these slips through from the secretariat to the reviewer, and I can tell you, having been doing this since 2003, there's nothing more irritating as a reviewer to get a sloppy submission. So please, people need to do these carefully. We get cutting and pasting, where you get parts of old studies in the middle of new ones. We get statements that are nonsense. And if a study is garbage, we will chuck it out. So please make sure that it's done properly, that there's no sort of typing errors, that there's no formatting problems. I mean, there's, you know, that the documents are all in place. Otherwise, it will be thrown out. And it is disrespectful to the committee to submit things that are of poor quality. We don't see this often, fortunately, but when it does happen, it is very annoying. Next, please. Now, the CTF1 is what counts, and that's the document that we get that is submitted to the to SAHPRA and their various components. There's the administrative and the clinical trial component. As I mentioned, the administrative component looks at the workload, details of the trialists and sites, how samples are collected, testing, screening, etc. Next, please. And regulatory details, including ethics. And then there are some other things that we have brought into here that have become important. There's an issue of post-trial access, which is an important issue especially in phase 3 studies, where a participant or participants may benefit on the treatment, and we cannot have a situation where if the study is over and the study's shown benefit, that participants are doing well, are then told, sorry, we can't give you any more treatment. You must go back to whatever you can get. And this is particularly an issue in the state sector, where a lot of new medicines, even though they may be registered, are not going to be available. And that's why we are very strong on post-trial access for patients on studies, particularly phase 3 studies. The only problem with it is how long. The current recommendation is 4 years, although it's still a problem because on the one hand, participants in study need to be allowed to benefit from what they receive. They're giving themselves to the study, but on the other hand, you can't expect a pharma company to provide free medicine for 50 years in someone with a chronic disease. And it's still an ongoing debate. And, maybe there can be comments about it afterwards. The current thing is 4 years, but it's very difficult. And I don't have the right answer. I don't think anybody has. And it's an important ethical issue. The other thing is the story about capacity building and transformation. We feel very strongly that clinical trials and clinical studies, there needs to be capacity building, development of up-and-coming healthcare professionals, doctors, nurses, pharmacists, and also transformation to allow people who were previously disadvantaged to play a bigger role. And this is something we push about, although it's not always possible, especially coming from some of the private sector sites, but it's something we do push on. Then we look at the actual trial, we look at the RP and supportive medicines, background information, objectives and endpoints. I mentioned methodology and design, eligibility, inclusion, exclusion criteria, data and safety monitoring plan, very important. We also need to know if there's an independent data monitoring committee, which in big studies is important, that you have an independent committee, and often the committees that are suggested aren't independent. They need to be independent, and they need to have decide when they meet and what their stopping rules are. That's a very important thing, especially in big studies. And then statistical measures are obviously very important, reviewed by the statistician. Next, please. And then I mentioned the ethics, and then the additional information, and then the declarations and CVs, etc. Next, please. And this is just an example of a study. It's not important what the study is, but of the template that the reviewers use. And the first part, we have the SAHPRA number, study title, phase of the study, protocol number, sponsor, applicant, national PI, and investigators. Next, please. Then we look at the RP, the details of the RP, how it's given, strength, dose, etc. The mechanism of action of the RP, comparator drugs need to be looked at. Next, please. Also, as well as comparator, concurrent medicines, any other medicines as well. And one thing I didn't show there, also we look at the GMP. We want to know the manufacturing, where the RP and the supportive medicines are sourced, where they're made, that they're made under GCP, how they get here. Because it's some medicines, it's very complicated. Things are made in one country and then part of it's made in another country and a third country, and it's very hard to track exactly what goes on with some of the medicines. We saw that during COVID, where a lot of the RPs are made in China, the medicines are then actually put together in India. And this chain can be quite tricky, and there can be sort of defects along the way, so it's a tricky one. Then we want to look at the objectives, primary, secondary, design and methodology, the rationale, and that's important. Why is the study important, especially in South Africa? Now, is it relevant to this country? Because some studies are not. We want to know that they're relevant to South Africa. Inclusion and exclusion criteria. Next, please. Capacity building and transformation, I mentioned. Insurance is very important, following ABPR guidelines that we'll come to. It's the other thing is the pill icon, the patient information, informed consent document. It's important that this is reviewed, that it's although it's predominantly an ethics committee role, but we need to make sure this provides information to participants about their insurance, about what happens if there's accidents, and about ABPR guidelines. Post-trial access, I mentioned, and then compensation, both participants and investigators, how they're going to be remunerated, and then the ethics, details of the ethics approval. Next, please. And then just going to finish off now. SAGCP, as I mentioned, this is what exists. South African Clinical Trial Guidelines, good practice for clinical trials with human participants. And as I said, unfortunately, the document that's still being used is for 2006. Hopefully the new one will be published very soon. I've been pushing for them to get all the paperwork done so it can come out, because all the work has been done. But unfortunately, as everyone knows, COVID has thrown everything out. But this should be available quite soon. And the reason why it's important is discussing a lot of new areas that weren't looked at in the past. Things like cell and gene therapy are looked at. Also issues of things like post-trial access wasn't thought of before. Compensation, issues of compensation have changed. There's a lot of new things that have come in the last 15 years. And so it's quite important that we have an updated document. So we hold thumbs that this will be out soon. And next, please. And this is just, I'm going to finish here because I think I've used up all my time, just to talk about ABPR guidelines, Association of British Pharmaceutical Guidelines. This is specifically for medicines, but basically it's if anybody, participant in a study, has an injury during the study. And the same thing would apply for devices or kits. And this includes death. The initial ABPR guidelines that came out in 1991, the initial ones, didn't cover death. It didn't have compensation for death. The new guidelines do require compensation for death. And this came up a while ago when there was a anti-TB study done some years ago where a number of patients had severe liver injury and died. Initially the sponsors didn't want to compensate the families, and eventually it took a lot of work by both SAHPRA and the ethics committees, what was MCC in those days, not SAHPRA, so that the participant families received some support, even enough just to have pay for the funeral in these studies. And so this is important, that there is compensation in the event of death. The whole point about it is that this is a no-fault guideline. And when on the balance of probabilities, the injury was attributable to the administration of an RP under study or any clinical intervention or procedure provided for by the protocol, that would not have occurred but for the inclusion of the participant in the trial. We prefer participant to patient, regardless of whether the adverse reaction causing the injury was foreseeable or predictable, or the fact that the participant had freely consented, whether in writing or otherwise, to participate in the trial. So it is basically, even though they have consented and that this may be known, there still is a basis for compensation based on these guidelines. And it should be paid regardless of whether the patient or participant is able to prove that the sponsor has been negligent in relation to research or development of the medicinal product under trial, or that the product is defective. So there's no admission or proof of fault. It's purely that there is compensation for injuries that participants may get on a clinical study, and this is quite important. This is over and above the individual investigator's personal malpractice insurance, because if the doctor or even pharmacist or nurse has been negligent, then their own personal malpractice insurance is needed and would have to come in. If you're employed by the government, then the government would be responsible for that. But this is specifically covers injuries related to the administration of RP and concomitant products on a clinical trial. And so it is important that every trial has some sort of insurance, because if there isn't, the investigators are responsible. As you're aware, with the COVID vaccines, there are compensations available if injuries do occur. Fortunately, these are not common, but they still do occur, and that all investigational processes must have ability to compensate participants for injuries that may occur, whether they are expected or not, and whether the person has consented or not. And basically that it's a no fault process, there's no one who's blamed, but it just provides for the participant to be adequately compensated for injury. And it usually would cover the medical expenses, things like that. It does not cover things like loss of income, short-term pain and suffering. And you may be aware, and I'm going to finish now, about the famous Venter versus Roche case in the Western Cape, where a participant on the clinical trial, Mr. Venter, sued Roche Pharmaceuticals and the doctors concerned following an injury on the clinical trial in colon cancer, because he wanted compensation over and above his medical expenses, including loss of income and pain and suffering. And this case went to the Western Cape High Court, 3 weeks in the Western Cape High Court at about 100,000 Rand a day. It's not cheap. It was then rejected, went to the Supreme Court of Appeal in Bloemfontein, who approved the rejection except for one part. It went back to the Western Cape High Court, who then a group of 3 judges, not just one, reviewed it and said that it was inappropriate, that both the doctors and the sponsors had done the right thing. The participant then tried to go to the Constitutional Court, who refused to hear that. But that was a very important hearing and case, because it shows that constitutionally participants in clinical trials, whereas they are entitled to compensation for injury based on the ABPI guidelines, they are not entitled to compensation for extended things like loss of income and things like that. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was really very useful. I think that many people who are attending are very interested in this aspect. So thank you, Paul. There was somebody who requested a question. I think had raised their hand. Let me just see if I can find my controls to find that. Sorry. Yeah, there you go. I think Judith Camber, you have your hand up. Perhaps you can just raise your speak if you can unmute yourself. I think you can go and ask the question. I don't see any Q&A, so if you do have questions and don't want to speak, please feel free to raise to put it in the Q&A. Judith, are you able to speak? Okay, I'm not sure that she put it up by mistake, but I think she has. All right. So thank you for that. I think, you had mentioned some of the questions, and you raised that controversy, Paul, about people receiving medication, post-trial,
Yes.
and, that it's sort of for 4 years now. But I can imagine if someone's getting a drug or something that's improved their life for 4 years. I mean, in a way, there can't be that many patients out there compared to the sales of the institution to continue that for the trial purpose, for the trial participants, for their life. Is that not a good rationale to argue the case, from a cost benefit to the company itself, that their trial participants are not necessarily very large. They provide the benefit, show the benefit, should they not get treatment for life. That's not very common. Many drugs would be in that case, but certainly looks cruel to take a drug away after 4 years.
Yeah. Shabir, you've raised a question that is so difficult, and there's been so much debate about this. Meetings, we interacted with the pharma companies, we interacted with NHREC about it, we interacted with the South African Clinical Research Association, and it was very difficult to get the right answer. I'll be honest with you, 4 years didn't come from me. It was a compromise. I think longer. But, the problem we had is, on the one hand, you have participants on studies. And this was particularly with chronic medicines, HIV medicines, new cancer medicines. People live longer now. And they would say, oh, well, we'll provide it until it's commercially available. The problem with being commercially available, it doesn't mean that most participants have access, because 90% of the new medicines will never be available in state hospitals because of their cost, unless eventually they're generics and they eventually got on the EML 20 years later. But, that's the problem. And that's why we feel that this should be done. The 4 years is a minimum. And it came about because, I was pushing for more. There was a lot of pressure from some of the pharma companies to say that, if we push too hard, they're going to stop doing studies here because they can't afford it, and it's easier for them to go and do their studies in Eastern Europe and in the Middle East and places like that where don't have the demands we have. And I can tell you it was very hard and it was very unpleasant situation. And, this is a minimum. We try and encourage it for longer. And, I agree 100% with what you're saying. It's just, this was a compromise that we reached to make sure that companies didn't pull the plug immediately the trial was over. And remember, it's 4 years after, not 4 years after the participant has finished the medicine, is finished being on the trial. It's 4 years after the trial is over. So, it is longer. So if you have because remember that even though someone may have data may have been collected, and that there still may be longer term follow-up. And so this is 4 years after the actual trial itself is closed. And so the participant may have already had their medicine for 4 years already. But and we get some chronic medicines where people, are life-saving and people are living long, long time. The big argument from the pharma company is that how can they be expected to pay? So you have a youngster with, say, the thing that came up for discussion, some of the cholesterol medicines, and these PCSK9 inhibitors, which are expensive, but are life-saving, especially in people with, sort of severe hypercholesterolemia, especially the familial hypercholesterolemias. And, that you put someone who's 15 on one of these medicines, they're going to theoretically need this medicine for years. And how can you expect them to pay forever? But, at the moment, that's the current guidelines. They're not right. And, it was a compromise. And, we value input on this because it's such a vexed issue, and it is coming up for rediscussion because of what you're saying. And, the more input, the better, because this is a very hard one to deal with.
No, thank you. I think that gives us some insights, and I think it's great that you're inviting that. And I think that when there's a debate, let us know, let the people know.
Yes,
I think
yeah.
they could
Look,
weigh in
that's
on
why
it.
we need input from, from everyone. It's. I can tell you, it was, it's
Sounds difficult.
easy. Yeah, yeah.
No, thank you very much, Paul. Really appreciate you taking the time off. Just to everyone that's listening in, we'll post his slides and the presentation that we've recorded on the website where you registered. So thank you, Paul. Very much appreciate that.
Just to tell you that there is the second
To
half
Christopher Stein.
It's just on a little bit on clinical trials. I didn't.
Yeah.
I wasn't going to. It just happened to be there. But if people want, just give an idea of how phase 1, 2, 3, 4 studies are done. So if people want to, they look at it. It's quite a useful piece on basic principles of clinical trials. Okay.
No, thank you. I found it very useful, and I'm sure others did.
Okay.
Thank you, Paul. And if you need to,
thank you very much.
I think,
and we'll
thank you.
Be in touch. Thanks for your help, and thanks for the.
Will do. Thank you. Take care.
This sort of communication and discussions. Right. I think it's very important have the more discussions, the better. So,
no, thank you. I'm sure people are going to use this as a resource, to do any application. So great stuff.
And if anyone wants
to
run something by me, people can, can approach me. You have my email.
Perhaps put your email. I don't know if it's on the slides, but you can just put in the chat group, and then I think
I'll put in the chat. It's not on the slides. I'll give you my email. So if anyone wants to run something by me,
yeah, that I think is very useful. Okay. Great stuff.
All right, so I'll put it down there. I'll give my email, and then once I've done that, I'm going to log off.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Don't use the bits one.
Well, we're very grateful. Thank you very much to Paul Ruff, Professor of Family Medicine and Head of the Clinical Trials Committee of SAHPRA. And we're very fortunate also to have Professor Christopher Stein, who's the chair of the UJ University of Johannesburg's Research Committee, Ethics Research Ethics Committee, and also does research work in UJ and has a background in emergency medicine. So welcome to Christopher. You can show us your picture and thank you very much. And I think also if you can, I think share slides. If you need to, email them to me if you have any battles, but I think you should be quite all right. Well, Chris, if you don't mind just sharing a little bit more about yourself as well, and before you start, and then go for it. Just tell us more about what's happening at UJ.
Sure, thanks. In terms of presentations, I just have 2 flow diagrams that I think will help a little bit. I don't have slides, but I'll put those. I can share my screen.
No, it's fine. Whatever you need to do, it's up to you. As long as you can convey your message well enough, it's okay.
All right, great, thanks. So I'm going to focus pretty much on ethics because that is my baby, so to speak, in health sciences. But just in terms of a background about myself. So yeah, quite correct. My background is in emergency care and specifically pre-hospital emergency care. Yeah, I did a PhD in emergency medicine at UCT in 2014. And then in a moment of insanity, I decided to do a second PhD in bioethics and health law. So that's what I'm busy with at the moment, and that's at WITS as well. So I've been a member of our research ethics committee in health sciences for about 11 or 12 years now that I joined the committee, and then I took over as a vice chair in 2014, and then I took over chairing the committee in 2017. And so in our faculty of health sciences at UJ, we don't have a medical school. You probably are aware of some plans that are afoot to open a medical school at UJ, but it's obviously a very long-term process, and so it's still on the radar as far as I know, but I haven't heard anything specific about that recently. Obviously, in the last year or so, just about everybody has been very concerned with other issues, how to come through this this pandemic alive. So it is certainly still there, but at the moment we don't have a medical school. So we have a number of different disciplines that are represented, but our biggest departments are nursing. And then we also have quite a big sport and movement department that includes things like sports science, biokinetics. We don't have physiotherapy as a discipline. Sport management, we used to have sports psychology, but that got split off and put in a different faculty. And then we also have some complementary medical disciplines, and we have radiography and a few others. So the focus of our research is, it's not a heavy clinical focus because obviously of the fact that we don't have a medical school. And so the type of research that we're doing is not that the type of thing. We do quite a lot of qualitative research, particularly in nursing. It's very popular in nursing. And that most of it is that type of thing. We also started with an MPH program in the Department of Environmental Health about 2 years ago. And the MPH program has proved to be very popular. It's an online program. And so obviously the research component is not online, but all of the coursework is online. So MPH programs generally, I think, are quite popular. So we had quite a deluge of students and a large number. So I think maybe to kick off with the actual REC itself, since I took over chairing it in 2017, we've had a huge increase in the volume of submissions to the committee for ethical clearance. So I think it predates 2017. But certainly since then, and one good example is the MPH program, where we've had a significant increase in numbers. And I know certainly from the annual reports that I've done for NHREC over the last 3 years, going on 4 years now, the increase in the number of proposals that we process every year it's been a double-digit percentage increase every year. So I think if you speak to pretty much to anybody from an REC anywhere, they will share the same story. So there's just most HEIs are growing, they're adding new programs. Our undergrad research component has grown significantly as well. And of course, all of that has to go for ethical approval. So that's one of the things that we've had to deal with, is this significant increase in proposal submissions. So just to give you an outline of the process, we've actually split our REC into two components. One of them is for postgrad research, and the other one is for undergrad research. And there are a number of reasons for doing this, but one of them is that we found that people or committee members who dealt predominantly with postgrad research quite often didn't understand what was going on at undergrad level. I mean, obviously undergrad research, the research projects are extremely narrow scope. They're small and simple projects that students have got to be able to do in a year. And the reviewers with a postgrad background were quite often, returning quite strange reviews that were geared more towards, doctoral level research and that type of thing. So we decided to split it, and basically we have, in the undergrad committee, we have reviewers and committee members that have experience and whose students themselves do undergrad research. So it really just helps with understanding where the undergrad students are coming from. And regardless of the scope or complexity of the projects, they all need ethical approval, and the ethical principles remain the same. So, but yeah, basically we have those two, and all told, if you add the committee members together from both committees, we're looking probably at about 40 people combined. And so we also have on both committees, we have a representation from every department. So obviously we want to attract committee members who have an interest in research ethics and are not disinterested in it, obviously. But in addition to that, we do also make sure that each department is represented on the committee. So we have the two committees. We have vice chairs, two vice chairs on each committee as well, and then there's myself. And effectively, I chair both. We are in the process. The undergrad committee is quite new still, and we're on the process of getting an independent chairperson for that committee. But obviously, we need to build a little bit of capacity for that first before we can go over to that. So at the moment, I'm chairing both committees. Importantly, though, we don't have different approaches on the two committees. So we have a uniform set of standard operating procedures, or SOPs, and those are used by both committees. So the actual procedures, the forms, the documents, and the whole process is the same for both committees. We don't. It's not like we do things differently on one or the other. So basically what happens, and maybe I can just share my screen here now quickly for these flow diagrams. Here we go. Let's see if that works. Okay, so
can see them. Thank you.
Okay, great. So I'm just going to start a little bit further down, actually. Basically, when a research proposal is submitted for ethics review,
Chris, you might make it slightly larger. Maybe people wouldn't be able to see the details. Sure. Just put it to screen width.
That a bit better.
That's better.
I'll just scroll down as I refer to different bits of it. So as proposals are submitted for ethics review, they are initially screened, and they're categorized as either low risk or what is often referred to in research ethics as minimal risk. We just call it low risk, and greater than low risk. So we have those two categories. We don't differentiate above low risk into what some people do and say like medium risk or high risk. And that's mainly due to the nature of the research that we deal with. We generally don't have very risky from an ethical perspective research. So we have those two categories, and everything is done online. So the supervisors who have access to this online system are the ones who upload the research proposals. And once they are uploaded, they come to me, and I will screen each one of them. I do the final screening, but when the supervisors upload, there's a set of questions that they answer, which triggers an algorithm that places each proposal into one of those two categories. But it's not the final decision of which category they go into, because algorithms are obviously not perfect. Neither are supervisors. And so not infrequently, the wrong response is chosen to a specific question, and the thing ends up getting categorized incorrectly. So I do a final screening of all of these things and just have a quick look at the title and the abstract and what the responses to those questions are, and just make sure that it is in the correct category. It's usually not a very onerous process to do that. So once they get categorized as either low risk or greater than low risk, each proposal then gets put into a different review process. So if they're low risk, they go through expedited review, and that's the flow diagram that's on the screen at the moment. And basically what that means, in a nutshell, I'll go through the different review codes in a moment, but basically expedited review is a process where a single reviewer will have a look at the proposal, and they will reach a decision on the proposal. And I'll mention those in a moment. But one of the key things is that in reaching that decision, the proposal doesn't go to an ethics committee meeting for a consensus decision. So because it's low risk, these are generally simple research projects from an ethics perspective. That single reviewer makes the decision, and then depending on what the decision is, the proposal will be either approved or it will be sent back to the supervisor for a variety of things to happen. So these are the decision codes that we work with, and in fact, this is the same whether it's expedited review or full review. We use the same codes. So basically, a 0-1 is where a reviewer is happy that there's nothing that needs to be changed. There literally is not anything that needs to be revised, and it's kind of good to go as it is, and it can go for ethical clearance. A 2A is where there is some revision to be made, but it's typically minor revision. So it's a few small things that do need to be changed. And to give you an example, perhaps it might be wording in an information letter or consent form. And it's not too infrequent that students especially tend to put in quite complicated technical language into information letters that a layperson wouldn't understand. And so in that case, we would give it a 2A, send it back to them and say, please just simplify the language in the informed consent documents so that the participants can understand it. But it doesn't need to go back into the review cycle after that. After you've done that, the supervisor signs off on it, and then it goes for ethical clearance. So that's a 2A, and it's minor revisions, effectively. It says you're not back to the reviewer because it doesn't have to go back for any kind of checking or anything like that. The next one is a 2B. And that is for problems with research proposals related to ethics that are a bit more complicated, and typically where a reviewer feels that there are changes that need to be made, usually in more than one part of the proposal or attached documents, that needs to be looked at again. So it's usually slightly more complex things, and it might also be the case that either the reviewer has asked for clarification of things and needs to hear what the student and supervisor or the researcher's response is, so they need to see it back again. Or alternatively, something that happens occasionally is where a document is left off a submission. So by mistake, a student perhaps doesn't attach a consent form or whatever. And obviously then it needs to come back. So that will be given a 2B. And what happens in that case is it will, once the student and supervisor or the researcher have finished revising it, it will be sent back. And this is all done electronically. It will be sent back to the reviewer, who will then check what changes have been made, and if they're happy with that, then it goes for clearance. Occasionally it happens that the reviewer is still not happy, and effectively then it cycles back. It goes back to the supervisor and student or the researcher for further changes, and then comes back again. But in 99% of cases, it will only go back once. A 0-3 is where there are bigger problems with a proposal, and it needs to come back. And typically, when an expedited review proposal has significant problems, it will then be channeled onto a meeting agenda for consideration by a meeting and a consensus decision. So that is usually where there's serious problems, or it might be a contentious issue in ethics, and something that an individual reviewer doesn't feel comfortable making a decision about. That's quite rare though, because expedited review by definition is low risk, and so that generally doesn't happen. But effectively a 0-3 will be then placed on the agenda for a meeting, and it will be tabled at a meeting. A 0-4, which is the last one there, we've actually never used, as far as I'm aware, as long as I've been around, which is a while. But it's basically there because I think if we don't have it there, probably tomorrow we would need it. But it's to accommodate situations where there's something radically wrong with research ethically, and it just has to be completely canned and a new project proposed. So we've actually never used it before. So those are the different categories, and this flow diagram is really just a summary of what I've said. So if it's fine, if it's good to go, no revisions necessary, it goes straight for ethical clearance. If it's a 2A, it will be revised. Supervisor signs off. There's a form that needs to be filled in to document the changes and the signing off, and it then goes for clearance. If it's a 2B, it gets revised and the reviewer checks it, and if the revisions are approved, then it goes to get a clearance letter. Could obviously go from a 2B to a 2A, and then it will go through that process again. So once the clearance letter has been issued, and that is also done electronically, so the clearance letters are generated via an automated process and then emailed to the supervisors or researchers. After that, it will then, in the case of an expedited review, it will be placed on an agenda of the next available meeting, but that is really just for noting. It's so that we can note those and that they appear in minutes of that meeting, so everything is documented correctly. But in order for the decision to be made, it doesn't have to go to a meeting. So obviously the word expedited implies that this process is quicker than the full review process, and it typically does tend to work out that way. So we give reviewers in the expedited review process, we give them 10 working days to submit their decisions, and most of them take around about 7 or 8 days on average. We do have some metrics about that. So it's a relatively quick process, and obviously, you know, if the proposal is well written and it's well put together and there are no problems, then it can be very quick. You might get your clearance within a week or a week and a half. Obviously, if it needs to go back, then it's going to take longer. So that is the expedited review process, and that's for low risk proposals. If a proposal is classified as greater than low risk, and reasons for that might be, for example, it's research that involves ethically more risky things. Maybe it involves deception. It maybe involves research involving prisoners. We had one of those the other day. It might be with research involving participants who cannot give informed consent in the normal way. It might involve minors. That type of thing then gets classified as greater than low risk. And the initial steps are the same. The main difference is that the proposal will go to 2 independent reviews instead of 1. And it will then go onto the agenda for a meeting. And at the meeting, there will be a consensus decision made on what should happen next. The decision codes are exactly the same. So that is no different. What sometimes, in fact, not infrequently happens is that reviewers, you know, obviously reach different decisions. So one, for example, might say that they think it's a 2A, and the other one might say that they think it's a 2B or a 3. And if you just think about the peer review process in scholarly publishing, it's absolutely not unusual for reviewers to come to different conclusions. So when that happens in the meeting, there'll just be a short discussion, and usually we ask the person who's given the kind of more severe decision, if I can call it that, just to justify why they did that and what their specific reason is for a 2B or 3. And if everybody's happy, once everybody's happy, it's a consensus decision about what the final code will be. Occasionally, and it's very, very occasionally that there isn't consensus, or we can't reach a decision by consensus. And in that case, it will just go over to a voting process in the committee. So yeah, once the decision is made, it then appears in the minutes of that meeting. But the process after that is basically very similar, in the sense that the feedback goes back to the supervisor or the researcher, and revisions are made according to whichever code was given, and eventually a clearance letter will be issued. So those are basically the 2 streams of review. The other thing is that once the clearance letter has gone out, in our committee, we don't kind of withhold the clearance letter pending gatekeeper permissions. I know some committees do that. So what we write in our clearance letter is that the letter that goes out is the final clearance letter, but it is conditional upon all gatekeeper permissions being in place before anybody collects data. We've just found that it's extremely onerous for RECs to have oversight over the whole gatekeeper permission process, in addition to managing research ethics. There isn't anything in particular in research ethics guidelines that says that is the responsibility of an REC. And so we've chosen to go that route, and ultimately then it's up to the researcher or the supervisor who has oversight over students who do research to make sure that all gatekeeper permissions are in place. The other thing that has to happen after the clearance letter has gone out and after research has started is that students have to apply for renewal annually. So our ethics clearances are valid for a year. And then there's a process that has to be followed to renew clearance if it's necessary. Obviously, very short projects, typically undergrad projects, are wrapped up within that year. But for others, they will typically go on for longer. And so there's a form that needs to be filled in and submitted. And that then on that form, it's what NHREC refers to as passive monitoring, where annually researchers are just asked to give an update about what stage they're at with their research, and if they've had any sort of minor adverse events. In terms of adverse events, if there is anything more than minor, there is a reporting process as well for that outside of the annual renewal. So that's obviously a bit more urgent if there's a more significant adverse event. But at the stage of annual renewal, the researchers are just asked basically to give an update of where they're at, what has happened, anything significant has happened that they need to report, and then they get issued with a renewed clearance letter. And that process basically goes on for every year that the research carries on. And yeah, that's basically the process. There are quite a few other forms for specific things, but I won't necessarily go into all of the detail. At the end of the research, students and researchers are also asked to fill in a form to indicate that their research is finished, and that we can flag it as completed. And effectively that ends off the ethical clearance process.
Well, thank you very much, Christopher. Prof. Stein, I really appreciate you taking the time out to share. To our participants, if you don't mind putting up your hand or putting your question into the Q&A or comments into the chat so that we can engage. Just a thought, I really found that useful that you went through the process of how permissions applied for, and it seems to be quite timely, quick and easy. And I also appreciate, as the chair of the Joburg District Research Committee at the moment, the fact that you're not asking for this permission before you issue ethics. And we're finding ourselves with the problem where WITS is actually saying they'll only issue the formal ethics when we give permission, and we want that ethics before we give permission. So it's become a bit of a mess because we are now, because we're going to expedite the process and WITS hasn't been unresponsive, we're giving the ethics, the letter, without knowing whether assuming that ethics is approved, but without having that ethics in hand. And I think for our record keeping, that's challenging. But I think I think you might be, might put in your letters is, even though you write gatekeeper permissions, I think for the purposes of the National Department of Health, writing that where that is the public service, that it is through the NHRD is very important, because we find that there are some institutions, some facilities, Joburg's not one of them, where facility managers are aware of the NHRD and the fact that there is a permission required from the senior person. So many a time people go to a clinic and tell the manager, and the manager, unwittingly will say yes to it without higher managers being aware of it. And I think the whole point in the NHRD and this committee is that there should be no research in a facility in any district without the permission of the senior manager in charge. And we're trying hard to make that expeditious as well, not onerous, but I think there's rationale. Ntobi Zodwa asks, what training is there in South Africa for RECs? So something, how do we train RECs in South Africa? I think she's interested in perhaps setting up one.
Yeah, that's a good question. I didn't speak about that. So it's an NHREC requirement, actually, National Health Research Ethics Council, that anybody serving on an REC has some kind of research ethics training. They're not very specific about exactly what that is. I remember at one of the NHREC annual meetings about 2 years ago, a question was actually asked about that. You know, is there kind of a standard curriculum or something for research ethics training? And the answer was no, there isn't. And nothing really further was offered. So, but there just has to be some form of training, and they do specify that part of that training needs to be an assessment at the end. That you have to kind of demonstrate some kind of competence. But there are a number of different courses that are available, quite a range. I know Wits, Steve Biko Center for Bioethics, I don't think they ran one this year, but they have run them in the past. There's also the TREE online program, which is free, which is the fact that it's online and free, I think is quite convenient. And there are a few others. In fact, I can't remember where I saw it now, but somebody compiled a list of all the different research ethics training packages that are available. It was actually quite a long list. It was about 7 or 8 different offerings.
Would you share that with me if you can, and then I can put it on the website?
I certainly will. I think, I'm just trying to remember where I saw it, but I'll go and have a look. It's in an email somewhere, and I'll see if I can dig it out. It was actually I was quite amazed by how many different ones they found that I wasn't aware of. We do also offer one at Health Sciences at UJ. We've got a short learning program, which is 2 days. We actually just ran one now recently in the last month, and probably will do so again in about October, November. So that's another option. But I think if anybody's looking for training that's very flexible and free, the TREE program is probably the best one.
Great. You'll send me that and we can just provide that to people on the website. So the recording and Chris, if you don't mind this 2-pager, if you just email it to me, we'll put it up so that if people want to be familiar with what's needed at UJ, they could have that available. Any more questions? Feel free to ask. I think Chris has been very clear about the process and the timelines, and I think that's really great. Just a quick question. What sort of primary healthcare type of research is happening in UJ? And what do you feel, if any, are the challenges of researchers from UJ doing work in primary care clinics in Johannesburg?
At the moment, most of it, I think, is related to the MPH program. I know that you've seen a few applications, and I think those have come mostly, almost exclusively from there. That falls within our Department of Environmental Health. They're running that program. Unfortunately, maybe because it's a new program, obviously when a new program gets off the ground, there's often a few teething problems. But one of the issues is that the MPH program, if you look at the structure of the program and the number of credits that are allocated for the research component, it's actually relatively small, which in itself is not necessarily a problem. But I think the offshoot of that is that the students, and especially the supervisors who are involved in that program, are wanting to do something meaningful with the research that they're doing, but they're quite limited. That when they try and do that, it's almost like overkill for the number of credits that actually carries. And obviously with an online program, there's a lot of emphasis on turnover of students. And so the time is quite limited that they actually have. So I know, especially when the process started, in reviewing these proposals, our comments were often, this is more like at a full master's or maybe a level even above that in terms of what they were proposing to do. And some of them were quite interesting, but many of them had to be scaled down. So that's, you know, that's, I think, one of the challenges that I think in the department, they are quite interested in doing some interesting stuff, but they're just quite constrained by the scope of those projects, which have to be quite small. The other thing is that a lot of the students, being an online program, are situated in other countries as well. So we have quite a few students from other African countries, and they end up doing research or collecting data for the research in their individual countries. So from an ethics perspective as well, that can be, I wouldn't say complicated, but we don't always know exactly what's in place in a lot of the different countries. So we're kind of looking at the ethics and even the scientific side of the research from a local perspective, not knowing what's really happening in other countries.
Well, Christopher, thank you very much. Prof. Stein, really appreciate it. I don't see any more questions and comments. It's been very helpful. We'll keep a recording of this on the website for anybody else who wants to look at it. And if you share those documents, I'll add them to that web page. And hopefully this is a resource for others. And we thank you for the work you're doing, and hope that we can have a good relationship between yourself and the Joburg Health District in terms of applications and work. So you're welcome if you think that there might be other things we could do together to reach out. Thank you, Prof. Stein. Take care. Thank you, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.